This video will provide a brief overview of the time period that we refer to as the Primeval History. It's the first video of a series that we're doing on the historical narrative of the Bible. Now, what this primeval history is actually the first part of what some scholars refer to as the primary history of the Old Testament. Primary history, it's this continuous historical record or narrative that begins in Genesis and moves all the way through to the time of the exile. And when you're reading through these books, you'll kind of notice how Genesis leads right into Exodus and into Leviticus, and it's just as following one story. And then even when you get to the end of the Pentateuch, when you reach the end of Deuteronomy, the story just kind of flows right into Joshua, on into Judges, and so on. And this all together is viewed as one historical arc or historical narrative. It begins right at the start of Genesis, in the beginning, goes all the way through to the destruction of the temple. And what we refer to as the primeval history is the most ancient part, the oldest part of the primary history. This is covering Genesis chapters 1 through 11. So just these first 11 chapters, this is the period that we refer to as the primeval history. The question of whether these chapters preserve an actual historical record is an interpretive question that, although fascinating, is beyond the scope of this video. So we're not going to be discussing the historical veracity of those chapters. Our purpose here is just to survey the content of those chapters as it helps us understand the overall biblical narrative. Now, the primeval history, of course, begins in creation, Genesis 1. I have an image here of an ancient conception of what the structure of the universe would have been like. It's well documented in the ancient world, and if you want to look this up, this is just one of many images you can find online, generally referred to as ancient cosmology. So cosmology is just referring to the origin and the structure of the created universe. This is one such image, and you'll see some things like, they believed that there was this sort of dome that was the sky. The sky itself was this solid dome. There were waters above that, and the windows of heaven could be open, and that would cause the waters from above to flood down on the earth. You had the sun, the moon, the stars, all were inside that firmament. And then humans, we live there on the land, and of course there's the waters below, sometimes referred to as the deep, in this illustration called the abyss, kind of surrounding this from the underside. And of course on land you have Sheol, which is underneath the land, which is just kind of like when we say Sheol, you can just think of it as a term referring to the grave. It's the place where you go when you die. You go down into the grave, down into Sheol. When you read through Genesis chapter 1, there are a number of really interesting features that we can pull out. One that I will just make mention of is this pattern of the days of creation, where we have first, on the first 3 days, realms that are being created, or domains, and then on days 4, 5, and 6 we have rulers corresponding to those realms. So for instance, on day 1 we have the creation of light and darkness. Corresponding to day 1 we have day 4, where God creates the greater light and the lesser light, and it says specifically to govern the day and to govern the night, so ruling over those realms of light and darkness. Similarly, on day 2, we have the creation of the sky and the creation of the seas. And then on day 5, corresponding to the sky, we have the birds. Corresponding to the sea, we have the fish. And then on day 3, we have the creation of dry land and vegetation. On day 6, then, corresponding to that, we have the creation of land animals, and specifically humans, as sort of the final act of God's creation, to create humans, and it says to rule over God's creation. So the second part of this, God's final act, again, to create humans, and it says specifically humans created in God's image. This concept is often referred to with a Latin phrase, imago Dei, just as a Latin phrase, means image of God. The image that we have here, this is just a detail from Michelangelo's depiction of the creation of man on the Sistine Chapel, very well known. I'm sure you've seen probably the full thing. Now, his painting expresses this idea that the image of God was fundamentally God giving humans the ability to think rationally. That is one possible interpretation that some people have. A better biblical understanding of what it fundamentally means to be God's image is that humans represent God as something kind of like an ambassador. As God has created the heavens and the earth and all the parts of creation, he creates humans as his image bearers and representing him to do his will. So God creates these heavens and earth, and then on day 7, it says that God rests. When it describes God as resting, this is a kind of expression used in the Bible to say that God is essentially taking his place as the king of all creation. He's taking his place on the throne, king over all. And then humans are placed on earth as his representatives. God takes his place in heaven, and then humans are set on earth to represent God and to do his will on earth. Now, the rest of the primeval history can be organized, and this is just a overview of this section, but the rest of the primeval history can be organized into 3 major, I call them crisis events. The first crisis is the event known as the fall. I'm sure you know the story very well. The serpent in the garden tempts Adam and Eve to break God's commandment, and specifically it's to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, eating from this tree, I think the basic idea of that temptation is for man and woman to define good and evil on their own terms, not according to what God has said, but that so they would be the possessors of the knowledge of good and evil, and they could dictate and determine what is good and what is evil on their own terms. That begins this is the first crisis event of the primeval history after creation. And of course, we have all the ramifications from that. Now, the second event is the flood. This is the second crisis event. Now, human corruption was so out of control, humans had become so evil that God sent a flood to destroy humanity. Now, their sin was marked particularly by violence and bloodshed. Humans were taking other human lives, and remember, humans were created in God's image. They bore God's image, and so when they were killing another human, they were killing an image bearer. And this sin and this violence was so widespread, it was so out of control that God sends a flood to destroy humanity. But of course, he preserves a remnant of those who are righteous. And I say righteous, I don't, of course, mean perfect. Noah, as if you keep reading the story, certainly was not a perfect person, but he was a righteous person, and God preserved him and his family. After the flood, God makes a covenant with Noah, and this covenants normally had stipulations or commandments associated with them, and this covenant had a commandment, a prohibition against bloodshed. And the reason for that is actually very telling. It says because humans are made in God's image. They bear God's image. And so it is wrong and sinful to unlawfully take another human's life. So that's the second crisis event. The third crisis event comes at the end of the primeval history, and that is the event known as the Tower of Babel. This is a story of human pride. Humans were, of course, given the command at creation, the mandate earlier, to fill the earth and subdue it. And that subduing the earth, I think, is a function of that imago Dei of representing God in creation, to fill the earth, subdue it, rule over it, representing God and his will. And now in this story, we have humans actually want to stay in one place. They want to build a city and they want to build a tower. Towers like the one described in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, are well known from Mesopotamia and the ancient world. Babel, the Tower of Babel, the word Babel is the same as Babylon, so it's the Tower of Babylon in southern Mesopotamia, located in that region. Are well-known towers. We refer to them as ziggurats. They were like a stepped pyramid structure. Here's just an image, an artist rendition of one based on archaeological remains of ziggurats that we've discovered from the ancient world. These structures were usually connected to a larger temple complex, which were temple complex were described in the ancient world as a place for the god's name to dwell. And this story in Genesis 11 instead shows humans wanting to build this great tower for their own pride, for their own ambition. And the center of this story, I think, is the human pride to what they say, to make a name for ourselves. The temple should have been a place for God, for the God's name to dwell. But here it's for humans to make a name for themselves. In some sense, this Tower of Babel is a mirror of the first crisis in the garden, where humans were tempted to claim knowledge, to claim what really belonged to God, and they wanted to claim that for themselves. And in that story, humans were cast out from the garden. In the story of the Tower of Babel, humans are once again scattered, and God scatters them, confuses their language, as a judgment against them for this pride. And it's out of the ashes of this story in the Tower of Babel that we finally then begin to see God's ultimate plan begin to unfold in the story of the biblical patriarchs. And that story will be the subject of our next video.